just changing a stop sign into a yield sign. And I looked for a way to be able to study the development of very big or rich false memories. Now, that's not an easy thing to decide to do, because how are you going to do it? If you're a professor at a university, as I am, whenever you, and many of you may know this, but you need to propose your research to a human subjects review committee that will decide whether to let you go forward with the research. If the committee thinks it might harm the subjects, they won't let you do the research. So we couldn't be proposing that we're going to be making people believe they have sex with the family dog. The committee would never allow that research. So we needed an analog, something we could try to plant in the minds of our subjects that would have been at least mildly traumatic if it actually had happened. And so we came up with the idea, why don't we try to make people believe that when they were a child, they were lost in a shopping mall or some other big store. They were lost for an extended time. They were frightened. They were crying. And they were ultimately rescued by an elderly person and brought back with the family. So that was our plan, but how would we do it? I want to use this slide to illustrate our method. So if you look at the man on the upper right, that's our subject. And we tell our subject, we've talked to your mother. And your mother told us about many things that happened to you in your childhood. And we want to present some of these childhood events to you and see what you remember. So you should think back to when you were a child, when you were 5 or 6 years old, and we'll ask you about these events that your mother told us happened. We then present our subjects with 4 stories. 3 of them are true experiences, and 1 is the made-up story about how when you were a kid, you were shopping with the family in a particular place, you were lost and frightened, and ultimately rescued and brought back with the family. We interviewed our subjects 3 times, separated by a week, and tried to get them to remember these experiences. And by the time we were done, 1/4 of our subjects fell for this suggestion and started to remember all or part of this made-up experience that we had planted in their minds. When the subjects began to remember these experiences, often they provided a lot of detail that hadn't been part of what we used to plant the memory, but this shows the kind of elaboration that is possible. So one woman began to remember that the person who she talked to had a long skirt or a sweater or a dress. She remembered the woman asking for her name, asking if she was lost. All this detail provided by the subject. And why that is important is because we use detail like this to try to tell whether our own mental experience is a real memory or one that is not real. And we use this kind of detail when we're listening to the stories of others, which we do if we're a police officer or a psychotherapist or just talking to a friend. We use detail to be a signal that what we are hearing is a real memory rather than something that is not. And this kind of study, these data show that even these false memories can have lots of that detail. After we publish our results, people complained, well, you know, getting lost is very common for a child. And so I don't think it's fair for you, people said to me, to be suggesting that if you can plant a memory of getting lost, that you can plant a memory of sexual abuse. At least show us that you can plant a false memory for something that would be more unusual, more bizarre, than getting lost and frightened and rescued. And other investigators in North America began to use these same methods to try to plant memories that would be more unusual, more bizarre. And so one group, for example, using a similar procedure, suggested to subjects that when they were a child, they had a horrible pain in their ear, and they went to a hospital. They had to spend the night for an investigation of a suspected ear infection. After 2 suggestive interviews, 20% of this sample of ordinary adults started to remember all or part of this made-up event about spending the night in the hospital. Another example, this research group suggested to subjects, you know, when you were a child, you went to a family wedding, and there was a table there with a punch bowl, and you were playing by the punch bowl, and you accidentally knocked into the punch bowl, and you spilled punch all over the parents of the bride. After 3 suggestive interviews, about a quarter of these subjects started to remember the accident at the family wedding. In another study, people received the suggestion that they, as a child, were a victim of a serious animal attack. After several suggestive interviews in this particular study, done in Canada, 26% began to have a complete false memory, and an additional 30% a partial false memory. And from the state of Tennessee, another example of this research convinced subjects that when they were a child, they nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard, with 37% falling for the suggestion and starting to adopt a false memory of this event. In a recent analysis of all of these false memory studies, Steve Lindsay, a Canadian psychologist, suggested that we call this technique the familial informant false narrative procedure. I don't like this name. He and his research collaborators suggest that in these studies, about 30% of the time, people have fallen for this suggestion. That is true, but I think the name of the technique this is too complicated. We should just call it the lost in the mall procedure after the original study that